Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's lecture hosted by the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I'm Asmaret Askedom, the Associate Deputy Director of the Center. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Greg Kobolentz to the CGSR lecture series. Greg's talk is called State-Sponsored Nuclear Proliferation, Why States Share Nuclear Weapons Technology. Since 1939, there have been 9 cases of states sharing nuclear weapons technology with another state. Greg will help us to understand what motivates states to do such a thing. Greg is an associate professor and director of the Biodefense Graduate Program at George Mason University. Previously, he was a visiting assistant professor at Georgetown University. He's also held positions at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In terms of today's format, Greg will take the first half of the 90 minutes to provide his lecture. The last half will be the Q&A session with the audience. Feel free to start raising your hands electronically and writing questions into the chat during the lecture. That will help us to transition smoothly into the Q&A session. With that said, Greg, thank you for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Asmaret, and it's a pleasure being here and being able to talk to you about this project on state-sponsored nuclear proliferation. This is actually the topic of a book manuscript that I'm currently completing. So what you're getting here is a sneak peek on my research, but hopefully will be out in book form not too long from now. So my book is motivated by a simple question: why do states share nuclear weapons, the most powerful military technology ever invented, with other states? The anarchic nature of international relations and the destructive power of nuclear weapons suggest this type of cooperation should be extremely rare. And yet, states have shared nuclear weapons technology with other states since the dawn of the atomic age. To start with, let me clarify what I mean by state-sponsored nuclear proliferation. I define this as a government's intentional assistance to another state's nuclear weapons program, including the transfer of weapons-grade fissile material, the technology to produce weapons-grade fissile material, and warhead design information. So I'm interested not only in the capability being provided, but also the intent behind it. My definition narrows the scope of sensitive nuclear assistance to those where the intent of the provider is to help the recipient build nuclear weapons. It does not apply to cases of nuclear weapon cooperation between 2 countries that already have these weapons. So, for example, my research covers Anglo-American nuclear cooperation during World War II, but not cooperation under the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement. My definition of state-sponsored nuclear proliferation does not include the following areas. Nuclear espionage by a state, such as that committed by the Soviet Union during the Manhattan Project, or by A.Q. Khan at the Urenco centrifuge facility in the 1970s. It does not cover illicit procurement and smuggling of nuclear technology or know-how by private actors without the knowledge of their government, as been done, for example, by German companies and scientists in the 1980s who were supplying Iraq and other countries. This definition also does not include the provision of civilian nuclear technology for peaceful purposes that could be misused to produce nuclear weapons, such as Canada's supply of the Sirius heavy water research reactor to India in the 1950s. I also do not cover the transfer of non-fissile nuclear material, such as Israel trading tritium to South Africa in return for yellow cake, because these are not weapons-grade fissile materials. I do not cover delivery systems that can be mated with nuclear warheads, such as ballistic missiles or the U.S. sale of F-16s to Pakistan, unless such systems are integral to the nuclear weapons cooperation. And finally, state-sponsored nuclear proliferation does not include joint custody arrangements for nuclear weapons, such as those used by the U.S. and NATO, where the U.S. retains control of nuclear weapons deployed on foreign soil, or, for example, Russia's deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus, which still remain under Russian control. So probably the best way to illustrate this phenomenon of state-sponsored nuclear proliferation is the story of how Libya obtained an almost complete set of nuclear weapons blueprints. Libya was given these blueprints wrapped in a plastic bag from the Good Looks tailor shop in Islamabad, Pakistan, by A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani scientist who was helping Libya build an industrial-scale enrichment facility at this time. Libya received these blueprints as a bonus for upgrading from the P1 to the P2 centrifuge and spending more than $100 million on the Khan Network's services. In 2003, As part of Libya's renunciation of its WMD program, Libya turned over these blueprints to the United States and to the IAEA. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that the bomb design provided by Khan did not originate in Pakistan, but in China. One clue was the use of a neutron initiator based on uranium deuterium that was the signature of early Pakistani and Chinese nuclear weapon designs. In the early 1980s, China had provided Pakistan with significant assistance for its weapons program, including 15 tons of uranium hexafluoride and 50 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. China also provided the design for a nuclear warhead that they had tested on a ballistic missile in the 1960s and provided some training to Pakistani scientists on how to design nuclear weapons. But that's not the whole story. The design that China transferred to Pakistan had its roots in assistance that the Soviet Union provided to China in the 1950s. In 1957, the Soviet Union agreed to provide China with an entire nuclear fuel cycle, including enrichment and processing facilities, as well as the establishment of a nuclear weapon research, production, and testing complex. The Soviets even promised to provide a model of their RDS-3 atomic bomb to China. Not their most advanced weapon, but the first Soviet nuclear weapon to enter mass production. As part of this agreement, the Soviets designed two facilities for the Chinese: the Northwest Nuclear Research Design Academy, which was modeled on Artemis-16, the Soviet Nuclear Weapon Design Center, and the Lop-Nor Nuclear Test Site. As I'll discuss later, the lineage of this nuclear weapon design helps answer the question of why states share nuclear weapon technology. Now, the starting place for my project is that everything we know about cooperation in international relations says that state-sponsored nuclear proliferation should be extremely rare. After all, nuclear weapons are the most powerful military technology ever invented, and helping another state acquire these weapons could pose a risk to your own security or survival. In the field of international relations, there are generally 5 obstacles states must overcome to engage in cooperation. These obstacles are particularly high when we're talking about a military technology as powerful as nuclear weapons. So the first impediment to cooperation is that the intentions of states are uncertain and unpredictable. States worry that today's partner could be tomorrow's adversary. So even though cooperation might bring short-term benefits, there are long-term risks associated with it. Second, when states assess the benefits of cooperation, they do so from the perspective of relative gains. They don't ask, how much will I gain from this cooperation? They ask, which of us will gain more? For a country to be willing to share nuclear weapons technology, they must think they have a lot to gain compared to the benefits that will accrue to the recipient of that technology. The third obstacle to cooperation is that states will be concerned that their partner will cheat. What if the recipient of nuclear weapon technology doesn't follow through on its promise of an alliance or of aid? A fourth concern is that poor security in the recipient state could allow the technology it receives to leak to a third party. This is especially worrisome if that third party is hostile to the state that provided the technology in the first place. The fifth obstacle to cooperation is that states will seek to avoid becoming dependent on other states. In a self-help anarchic international system, it's safer to rely on your own capabilities to defend yourself than to rely on allies of uncertain reliability. And being reliant on a foreign power for the most powerful weapon in your arsenal is fraught with all sorts of problems. So for all these reasons, we should expect state-sponsored nuclear proliferation to be extremely rare. And yet, despite these formidable obstacles to cooperation, I've identified 9 cases where states have deliberately assisted another country's nuclear weapons program by providing weapons-grade fissile material, the ability to produce weapons-grade fissile material, or nuclear weapon design information. There's several things worth noting about this list. First, state-sponsored nuclear proliferation has been going on since the dawn of the nuclear age. The first case was the British hearing of the Maud Report with the United States in July of 1941. The Maud Report was the first official assessment by any government that a weapon based on nuclear fission was both feasible and obtainable in enough time to influence the course of World War II. Until that time of this report, the critical role of fast neutrons in creating an explosive chain reaction had not been properly understood. With the Quebec Agreement of 1943, Anglo-American cooperation on uranium enrichment and warhead design was institutionalized. Second, nuclear sharing has been a major contributor to the spread of nuclear weapons. The sharing of nuclear weapons technology was crucial to the development of nuclear weapons by China and Israel. In addition, nuclear sharing accelerated the American, British, and Pakistani programs. For example, the British sharing the Maud Report with the United States played a bigger role in galvanizing the Manhattan Project than did the letter that Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt in 1939, despite what Christopher Nolan might think. Libya and Syria might have become members of the nuclear club thanks to sensitive nuclear assistance from other states if outside intervention had not stopped their programs before they reached completion. Third, nuclear sharing is currently associated with rogue actors like AQCon in North Korea, but it's worth noting that virtually every nuclear weapon state has shared nuclear weapons technology at some point with another state. Fourth, the history of nuclear sharing is characterized by 5 cases where nuclear weapon cooperation ended prematurely. You can see that at the far right column under outcomes. This is true even between states who are very close allies, such as the United States and Great Britain and the Soviet Union and China. Given the formidable obstacles to nuclear cooperation, it shouldn't be surprising that states get second thoughts or get cold feet when it comes to sharing these weapons technologies. Such cases provide a useful means for studying how changes in external or internal factors can affect a government's motivation to engage in nuclear sharing. So to return to my original question, why do states share nuclear weapons technology with other states? The answer to that question can be found in the lineage of the nuclear bomb blueprint that was discovered in Libya. Each of the transfers of nuclear weapon know-how that ultimately resulted in a Chinese nuclear weapon developed in a Soviet-designed facility winding up in a Pakistani shopping bag in Libya was motivated by different factors. My basic argument is that states seek to securitize, politicize, or monetize their nuclear weapon capabilities by sharing these capabilities with other states. So, for example, during the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev agreed to help China build nuclear weapons to ensure Mao Zedong's support against his domestic political rivals. In the early 1980s, China came to the aid of its ally Pakistan at a critical period when Pakistan was vulnerable to a first strike by its arch rival India. In the 1990s, AQ Khan's sale of centrifuge technology and warhead design to Libya was motivated by greed. While political scientists tend to privilege nuclear weapons as the absolute weapon that revolutionized warfare, political leaders have seen nuclear weapons as just one of many tools of statecraft. Therefore, it should not be surprising that different leaders have different motivations for sharing nuclear weapons technology. So let me describe these 4 motivations in more detail. According to the national security model, decisions to engage in nuclear sharing are responses to external threats and are driven by balance of power calculations. There are 2 ways that security concerns can lead to state-sponsored nuclear proliferation. First, a state might want to help an ally develop nuclear weapons to confront a common enemy. Concerns about relative gains are reduced when states are long-term allies who face a common enemy. The cooperation between the United States and Great Britain on nuclear weapons in the 1940s, driven by the joint fear of Nazi Germany, was motivated by just such concerns. Second, nuclear weapon sharing may also be based on the logic that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This type of cooperation is not based on an alliance, but is a substitute for an alliance. Nuclear weapons cooperation can be used by states to avoid offering or accepting an extended deterrence commitment. Extended deterrence is fraught with uncertainty and typically requires the deterrer to engage in costly actions that demonstrate the credibility of their commitment. Providing a nuclear weapon capability to the threatened state allows that state to engage in direct deterrence of a potential aggressor. A good example of this motivation is China's support for Pakistan's nuclear missile programs to balance against their common adversary of India. Franco-Israeli nuclear cooperation in the 1950s was aimed at their common adversary, Egypt. This type of nuclear cooperation allowed both China and France to secure the survival of their protégés without having to commit their own troops, nuclear forces, or the credibility to defend those states. State-sponsored proliferation can also serve domestic political purposes. The key to understanding this model is the insight that some leaders are more obsessed with the domestic balance of power within their country than they are about the international balance of power between countries. Leaders obsessed with the regime security will calculate the benefits of nuclear weapon cooperation from the perspective of relative gains vis-a-vis their domestic rivals, not international rivals. Thus, the decisions that appear to weaken a state at the international level may in fact strengthen that leader compared to their domestic rivals. Leaders can also use nuclear weapons to bolster their own domestic standing by engaging in nuclear cooperation with ideological allies who can bolster their legitimacy. The best example of this model is Soviet assistance to China in the 1950s. Even though the Soviet Union and China were allies and shared a common enemy at the time, there's strong evidence that domestic political considerations on both sides dictated the timing and nature of Soviet nuclear assistance. The Soviet decisions to provide nuclear assistance to China in 1954 and 1957 were preceded by internal power struggles within the Kremlin, which Mao provided decisive support to Khrushchev, allowed him to solidify his hold on power. The apogee of Sino-Soviet nuclear cooperation came in October of 1957. The 2 countries signed the New Defense Technical Accords, under which the Soviet Union agreed to provide China with a complete nuclear fuel cycle, a nuclear weapons production complex, and a model atomic bomb. The agreement was a reward for Mao after he supported Khrushchev following the June 1957 anti-party incident, which was the most serious threat to Khrushchev's power at the time, as payback for Mao allowing the Soviet Union to dominate a major international Communist Party meeting held in Moscow in November of '57, which represented the apex of Sino-Soviet political cooperations and good relations. Sino-Soviet cooperation on nuclear weapons fell apart when Mao, for his own domestic political reasons, began criticizing Khrushchev. In retaliation, Khrushchev terminated assistance to China and withdrew all the Soviet experts who had been assisting China's military nuclear programs. So in the space of just a few years, Soviet assistance to China went from being unprecedented to non-existent. This decision was based on not based on a changing balance of power between the Soviet Union and China or between the communist bloc and the West, but was a result of an ideological conflict that threatened the domestic political legitimacy of both leaders. States may also share nuclear weapons technology in return for tangible material benefits from the recipient. Under this mercantilist strategy, states are in effect monetizing their nuclear weapons expertise and capabilities. Since there's no free and open international market in nuclear weapon technologies, a state that's willing to sell sensitive nuclear technology that others are not will find they have a comparative advantage. Exploiting this comparative advantage by selling nuclear weapons technology will be attractive to countries that lack a strong comparative advantage in other legitimate businesses. Under this model, a state capitalizes on its willingness to sell sensitive nuclear technology to maximize its absolute gains. So in effect, the calculation of relative gains of how much another country will benefit is not a constraining factor because this country is interested only in how much it earns in total from this transaction. The clearest case of this mercantilist motivation is North Korea's construction of a plutonium production reactor for Syria in the 2000s for an undisclosed sum. If the Pakistani government exchanged centrifuge technology and know-how for ballistic missiles with North Korea, that case would also fall under this category as well. The last category is the mercenary model. Under this model, a sub-state actor that enjoys a high degree of autonomy is able to sell nuclear technology for its own benefit. In effect, corruption provides a mechanism for the absolute gains of an individual or small group to override the relative gains of an entire nation. The risk of corruption is heightened in systems where there are high degrees of secrecy and compartmentalization, such as in nuclear weapons programs, which enables sub-state actors to pursue their own interests away from the prying eyes of government officials. And I should clarify, by sub-state actors, I'm talking about scientists, program managers, officials within a government that are part of the state, not private actors that are not affiliated with the government at all. Now, there obviously been a lot of debate about whether A.Q. Khan was a patriotic proliferator operating with his government's approval or a rogue scientist motivated by greed. Based on my research, Khan was a nuclear mercenary in all three cases I examined, that of Libya, Iran, and North Korea. The key to Khan's success was Pakistan's mismanagement of its nuclear weapons program, which created a huge principal agent problem that allowed Khan to abuse his position. In his memoirs, President Pervez Musharraf writes that when he took over the government in October of 1999, he found himself, quote, solely in charge of all our strategic programs. I soon realized that I could not devote as much time to them as required. This is the heart of the principal agent problem. The principal does not have enough time or expertise or resources to formulate and implement a particular policy, so they delegate that responsibility to a subordinate to carry out their wishes. In its quest to develop nuclear weapons as quickly as possible, Pakistan had granted A.Q. Khan an incredible level of operational, administrative, and financial autonomy, and failed to put into place any oversight mechanisms until 2000, when Musharraf came into power. These conditions were the perfect breeding ground for corruption and enabled Khan to secretly sell nuclear technology for his own gain. One of the key lessons from the Khan case is that we should not focus so much on the individual's motivations, but on the structural conditions that allow them to act on these motivations. So here again is the list of the 9 cases of state-sponsored nuclear proliferation that I've mapped out across the 4 motivations I've just described. Now, it should be noted that none of these cases of nuclear sharing can be explained entirely by any single model. Indeed, different models may have different greater explanatory power at different phases of nuclear cooperation. So, for example, there are a couple of cases where domestic politics was not really important for initiating nuclear cooperation, but it played a role in ending that cooperation. So, for example, in the case of Anglo-American nuclear cooperation, the death of Franklin Roosevelt in April of 1945 removed the strongest proponent of Anglo-American nuclear cooperation from the U.S. government. And the rise of Truman to the presidency allowed the other bureaucratic actors who were opposed to greater Anglo-American cooperation to have a much greater influence, and this contributed greatly to the end of Anglo-American cooperation in 1946. Even though the McMahon Act, legally ended that cooperation, it was, quote, a closing the door that's already been locked, or locking the door that's already been closed. Since really the cooperation had withered once Roosevelt had passed away and Truman came in with a different set of advisors. It's also worth noting that motivations of states providing nuclear technology and the state obtaining that technology might be different. And when these motivations diverge, this can cause friction, and one of the reasons why these cases of cooperation sometimes are terminated before the program is completed. Nonetheless, these models serve as a practical purpose in differentiating the causes of nuclear sharing and highlighting the conditions that lead to its termination and initiation. And this is particularly important for crafting non-proliferation policies that I'll talk about shortly. So in my book, I did case studies on the Anglo-American cooperation during the 1940s, Sino-Soviet cooperation in the 1950s, and I also covered the 3 AQ Khan cases. During the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about these cases or any of the other ones that are on this table as well. So why should policymakers and the non-proliferation community care about this topic? So first, state-sponsored nuclear proliferation will likely be at the root of the next nuclear crisis. The protracted nuclear crises with Iran and North Korea that have been ongoing since 2002 were fueled by their access to Pakistani centrifuge technology, courtesy of AQ Khan. The next nuclear crisis could also be sparked by state-sponsored nuclear proliferation. Given its perennial quest for hard currency, North Korea is constantly looking for ways to monetize their nuclear capabilities. It already sold a reactor to North Korea, has advertised lithium-6 and reactor-grade graphite for sale. Maybe plutonium is next. Iran could also emerge as the next state willing to transfer sensitive fuel cycle technology to other countries. Iran's nuclear program is ripe for the same type of principal agent problems that afflicted Pakistan's program. In particular, the high degree of autonomy enjoyed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its roles in the nuclear weapons program and Iran's financial and transportation sectors and control over smuggling networks in and out of the country creates the conditions necessary for the emergence of a Persian AQ Khan. On the recipient side, Saudi Arabia has publicly stated that it will require nuclear weapons if Iran does. Given Saudi Arabia's lack of indigenous nuclear technologies, foreign assistance is widely seen as being a vital component to a future Saudi nuclear weapons program. Another concern is that state-sponsored nuclear proliferation could prevent the international community from detecting proliferation until it becomes a fait accompli. Extensive covert foreign assistance could not only save a proliferator time, but also circumvent the international nuclear export control system that provides early warning of nations' nuclear ambitions. The combination of a faster and less easily detected proliferation would reduce the amount of time that other states would have to use diplomacy, sanctions, and other means to either coerce or persuade a state to abandon their nuclear weapon ambitions. Now, the United States intelligence community has a mixed record in detecting state-sponsored nuclear proliferation. The United States was aware of Soviet assistance to China in the 1950s, but not its scale or its scope. And so we were surprised that China's first nuclear test used highly enriched uranium, whereas all previous tests had used plutonium by the countries that had gone nuclear already. And this was because the United States did not fully appreciate and understand the amount of assistance the Soviet Union provided China in the area of gaseous diffusion and the construction of the Lanzhou plant, as opposed to the much more limited assistance the Soviets provided to China for their reactor and reprocessing facility before cooperation was terminated in 1960. The United States was also slow to identify Dimona as a plutonium production reactor because they did not think that Israel could build a reactor on their own and that the United States would know if they had outside help. And so the idea of state-sponsored nuclear proliferation wasn't really on the radar of the intelligence community, and so they didn't really fully explore that situation and look too closely at what France and Israel were doing in the Negev Desert. The United States did do a very good job of detecting China's transfer of a nuclear weapon design to Pakistan in the 80s. Based on declassified documents, it appears that we were aware of that transfer within a year of it taking place due to assets in both Pakistan and China. U.S. intelligence on the Khan network was a mixed bag. We had excellent intelligence on Khan's deal with Libya, to the extent that we were tracking shipments of materials going to Libya. We were able to intercept them en route, and we're able to surprise the Libyans with just how much we knew about the assistance they're getting from the Khan network. We did have good intelligence on North Korea's acquisition of Pakistan origin or technologies and their international procurement. But we had poor intelligence on the Khan network to work with Iran, which really only came to light after IA access to Iranian nuclear facilities in 2003. Finally, the United States suffered a major intelligence failure regarding North Korea's construction of a reactor in Syria. It was Israel that detected this reactor, and it only did so when this project was already well advanced, which left a very short window of opportunity to stop it. This is when Israel decided to launch a military strike on the reactor and destroy it with an airstrike. So understanding the motivation behind the provision or pursuit of nuclear weapon technology is necessary to guide nonproliferation policy. An effective nonproliferation strategy needs to be tailored to both the supplier and the recipient. So this places a premium on obtaining accurate intelligence on the intentions of both parties. In short, state-sponsored nuclear proliferation is a wild card that complicates the already complex task of assessing foreign nuclear weapons programs and forecasting their future trajectory. Finally, state-sponsored nuclear proliferation could have a corrosive effect on nuclear nonproliferation regime. The regime is already under unprecedented stress due to geopolitical trends that increase the demand for nuclear weapons and blunt the effectiveness of traditional nonproliferation tools. If state-sponsored proliferation results in a country successfully developing nuclear weapons, both the supply and demand for such proliferation could increase. Such a case could stimulate the interest of additional states and how they could securitize, monetize, or politicize their nuclear capabilities. The successful incident of nuclear weapon cooperation could also inspire less developed states to seek out nuclear cooperation with other states as a shortcut to the bomb. The allure of this shortcut may be very tempting for a country desperate to enter the nuclear club, despite the risks. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed my preview of my work in this area, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.